I'm Matt Downing, and welcome to Diving Deep EDU.
Curious conversations with all types of peeps. Encouraging innovation, we are diving deep. Certainly education is what we like to speak. Fervent with dedication, now it is time to teach. Yeah.
Hey everyone, and thanks for joining me on Diving Deep EDU. This podcast is based in conversations that are willing to go off on a rabbit trail or two in order to find those aha moments. Those times when someone is able to say something in a way that brings increased clarity. Now, I'm an educator, so much of our conversations will have that as the end goal. How can the things that we are talking about help us to dive deeper into educational practices? Thanks for tuning in. Our guest today is John Couch. John is a pioneer of the American tech boom. He was hired by Steve Jobs as the 54th employee and became Apple's first vice president of education. He has worked personally with schools. He is an author of Rewiring Education. He owns a winery as well as a music production company. John, thank you so much for joining me. You just got done a big move. You're in the middle of a big move. How are things going for you?
Things are going great. I've moved all my family down to San Luis Obispo, which is a beautiful college town. So it's enjoying it.
Cool. Well, thanks for joining me. I got most familiar with your work through your book, Rewiring Education. That book has been super helpful for me in better understanding education and the role of technology. And we're definitely going to get into that. But as I researched your work, I've learned that you're a man of many talents and a man of many interests. So we have a lot to cover. And one of those things is a winery. You started a winery in California, Santa Cruz Mountains. The winery looks exquisite. And you use organic fruit and you bottle by hand. What caused you to want to start this winery?
Well, I am Italian, so it's somewhat in my blood. And I did spend my junior year and high school years in France, and this was back in the early 60s, and we couldn't drink the wine. We couldn't drink the water, and so, we drank wine for dinner.
Now, people love drinking wine, What is something that the common person, the common wine drinker, doesn't know in respect to wine making?
Oh, my gosh. I have an expert. My winemaker is Bill Brousseau, and I leave everything up to him. And that's been very positive because in our third year, our cab scored 96 points. And 96 points for the reserve and 93 points for the estate cab. And the 18, which we just bottled, he has told me is the best yet. So it's been fun. I'm doing some unique things. I have what I call a hero line. And so I just released Waz Chardonnay, where I worked with Waz to tasting different grape varietals, and we put something together that he liked, and he's signing bottles, and $20 of every bottle goes to Jewel, the Singers Foundation, inspiring children, and so it's fun. And I will be bottling Jewel's Pinot this June. And the same thing, $20 a bottle will go towards her foundation.
Oh, that's wonderful. And congratulations on the high scores. What do you think? I mean, I know it's probably a number of different factors that went into that, high score for your wine. Is it the grapes? Is it the making? What are some of the most important features that allowed you to get there?
Well, I think it's a combination of 3 or 4 things, maybe even more. One, a winemaker who knows what they're doing. 2, I happen to be in a great area for Cabernet Sauvignon.
Mm,
The soils are all clay and stresses the grapes out somewhat. It makes a great cab.
mm,
And third or fourth, it's all organic.
yeah.
We hand prune everything. We drop fruit to maintain the highest quality, and we only use the best French oak barrels,
Mm,
and we only use them for 2 years at the most,
okay.
whereas most wineries will use them 3 or 4 years. And I think it's paid off, and that's why we're getting the high scores in the 90s.
Congrats, and it's great that you're working together with some of these other people too to bring about awareness and bring some money to these other great causes. That's exciting. You also have, like I mentioned in the introduction, you also have a music production company called Eden Inspirations. Can you tell us a bit about Eden Inspirations?
Yeah, sure. I'm laughing when you call it a music production company, but I guess that's what it is. But when I went to grad school, they told me unless you were profitable, you didn't have a business. So, and this is not for profit. I went through a surprise divorce about 5 years ago that really shook me, and I couldn't sleep that well, and so I started to get up early in the morning and just started reading and journaling. And uh, I actually pulled my first song, "Trust in Me," from the journal, and found a young man in Hollywood who could play the piano, and we actually recorded it with just the piano, and then I recorded it as well in Nashville with a full band. But we liked the piano the best, and that was probably the first of 40 songs I've written in that time. And we have 3 CDs out, and the fourth one coming out probably this summer. And what's been fun is finding talent. So, for instance, when I was in Nairobi visiting a school, this young girl sang one of my songs, and I asked her very simply, would you like to, would can I create a song for you, and would you like to sing it? And she did, and part of the song's actually in Swahili, and it's really got a great beat. And so it's really just showcasing the talent that our youngsters have. And so we'll do all the recording and printing the CDs and putting it up both on in Apple Music and Spotify. And I think our music has now been heard in 73 countries. And yeah, it's been a lot of fun. When I was in China last year for my book, which was the number one selling education book in China, I handed out some of my CDs, and I got responses by some of the young youngsters that were on the PR tour, that when they listen to the music, it's the only time they have peace in China. So it's been interesting just to share my journey and see, and look, I'm an engineer, I'm a computer scientist, right? I mean, what do I know about music? But it's remarkable what you can do when you set aside the time and get remove the cacophony of all of the sounds of the world, and just think and try to come from your heart and share.
Yeah, now your love of music, was that there throughout your whole life, or is this something that came more recently when you were talking about starting that journaling process?
Look, man, I'm a child of the '60s. The Doors, Jefferson Airplane, the Beatles. I mean, you couldn't survive in the '60s if you weren't into music. And Apple was really, and Steve was really big on music, and music was always part of Apple's DNA as well. So it's been fun. I wish I could sing. I can tell you that passion or motivation was destroyed in the first grade when when the music teacher asked for a volunteer to come up in the front of the room and sing this, and nobody in the class would volunteer. So I said, "Okay, what the heck? I'll do it." And of course, everybody in the class laughed. And, that was my last time I ever sang.
Hmm.
tells you
Yeah,
tells you the impact our education, the negative side of that our education have on a youngster.
without a doubt. Yeah. You have a number of powerful lyrics on your website and the songs. As I was listening to them, one of the lines or the series of lines that really caught me and sort of brought my attention was these. 4 years ago, God sent me a love letter in a black envelope. The love of my life and I parted ways. I descended into the valley of sorrow. I was devastated and could not sleep. In the darkness of the early mornings, I prayed for understanding. What was the process of being able to get those powerful lines on paper?
Well, like I said, first and foremost, seeking a quiet place,
Hmm.
a place of solitude. Um, some people refer to it as a secret place,
Hmm.
where you allow the spirit that's within you to come to the surface and speak and basically listen and hear
Yeah.
words that after you're finished, you look at it and you go, "Whoa, that came from me,"
Hmm.
unbelievable. And it was I was blindsided, thought that my life was perfect and in all ways and set for the rest of my life. And you get that God, that came from a pastor friend of mine whose sermon was about how God seeks us, you
Hmm.
know. And Bill Bright once told me that religion is man's search for God, but Christianity is God's search for man. But
Hmm.
you gotta listen. You gotta be quiet and hear Him. And so I've done that now for 5 years. I've posted on Facebook on Eden Inspirations CA for Cal,
Hmm.
and I think I've now posted 1,000 days in a row.
Oh, wow.
And at the same time, we finished Rewiring Education, and I just finished a new book that's going to print and next week, and it'll be out in May, called My Life at Apple and the Steve That I Knew. And it tells an entirely different story of Steve than what you've heard in the past.
That's great. We're gonna have you back on when that releases. We can talk about that.
It was fun. It was fun doing it. It was fun, going back to the early days and when Steve was 21 and I was 29, and
Hmm.
the early days of Apple, and everybody telling us we would fail, and just to go back and relive that, and now to see where Apple is, it's unbelievable journey.
Well, let's go back in time a bit. I don't want to harp too much on that because that's probably a separate conversation. But you were hired as the 54th employee at Apple by Steve Jobs. In Rewiring Education, you tell the story about how Steve Jobs persuaded you to leave Hewlett Packard for his new startup tech company. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, I mean, the way it started was my boss at Hewlett Packard was hired by Apple to be their VP of engineering. And in the early Apple days, Apple didn't have a lot of software. They had the basic interpreter that Woz wrote, right, by hand, one line at a time,
Mm.
in hexadecimal. And they had two small utilities: a data mover that would move data from a cassette recorder into memory, and one other utility. And so I told them when they interviewed me that you guys, you got to get your software act together,
Mm.
because and finally Steve said, he says, I think I've sold an Apple II to everybody in the world that can program in BASIC or assembly language. I need a new environment that
Mm.
that can empower the non-programmer. And that's exactly what my PhD work was going to be on at Berkeley. But Steve was asking me to leave Hewlett Packard, where I was a candidate for my boss's job, and I was making probably $35,000 more than Steve was offering. Because at that time in Apple, the maximum salary was 40K.
Okay.
And a reason for that was because Steve wanted to recruit people who shared his vision and not who simply saw it as a financial opportunity. And he was asking me also to go from managing about 140 people in the lab to managing no one and just working with himself. And so I met Steve. I shared his vision. I knew, having been one of the first 50 computer scientists out of Berkeley in '69 and '72, that the personal computer was real,
Yeah.
and not just a game machine that a lot of the traditional companies thought, like HP and DEC at the time. And so I just told him I need to think about it because it was a family decision, not just mine. And and then typical Steve shows up at my house on a Friday night, I believe, and and comes into my kitchen, puts an apple II on the kitchen table, and tells my 4-year-old son Christopher, "You can have this if your dad comes to work for me." And so the TV didn't go on the whole weekend, and Chris got on that mental bicycle and rode and went places that I didn't think a 4-year-old was capable of doing it.
Interesting.
But then on Sunday night, I said, Chris, don't get too attached to this because I may have to return it. And he goes, "Why, Dad?" And I said, "Well, if I don't take the job, I need to bring it back tomorrow." And he looked at me and he said, "Well, just say yes, Dad." But he went on to be a computer science major at Penn, and his daughter, my granddaughter, is a computer science major at Baylor. So we may be the first 3-generation computer science family.
There have been many books, obviously written about Steve Jobs. You have a book coming out. Again, this is more for another conversation, but I wanted to get a little taste. What was a characteristic, in your interaction with Steve Jobs and your friendship there that resonated most with you?
The two words that come to mind for me, one was complexity. Steve was a very complex person, very driven person. Probably, he told me one time in our early days, he goes, John, he goes, "I want to give something back." He goes, "The car that I drive, the clothes that I wear, the food that I eat are all through someone else's accomplishments. I want to give something back." And that something back was, to make technology improve, empower us as individuals. And then I think the other thing for me was his heart. I mean, he had a great heart, particularly for younger kids. I don't think he was. I think he felt that by the time they got to college, you know, it was a lost cause. But the elementary kids he loved them, and I mean we gave many computers to kids that wrote in pencil on lined paper. And a lot of that's in the book because there's the book's stories. And Steve was a storyteller, an excellent storyteller. And I like to say that, his words were colorful. His words painted pictures for you, whether it was the mental bicycle, or giving something back. So I kind of tell the story, and it's interesting because the words that hit me the most in his commencement speech at Stanford was when he said, "You can only connect the dots looking forward." And so I wrote the book basically on that theme, by connecting my dots in the past that led me to Steve. And then connecting the dots at Apple. And after I left Apple in end of '83, I spent 10 years in the ministry with a failing Christian school in North County, San Diego.
Yeah.
And so I was able to see, what the real problem was in education.
I know.
And it's kind of ironic because I didn't realize it at the time, but by going back and looking at the dots, Steve told me when I told him I was leaving Apple, he goes, that's okay. He says, let's take what you've learned in business and apply it to education, and then come back after you've learned the education market, if you want to call it that, and share it with Apple. So he knew 10 years, 15 years before I before I did that I would be back at Apple. That's the Steve that I know.
Yeah, and that really stuck out to me, reading about your work and your life. You left Apple to go work in that public school, like you just said. What was it that pulled you to go do that work?
Okay, first, it wasn't a public school, it was a private school.
Oh, it was a private
And
school. Okay.
yeah. And, look, I retired at 36 years old. And, and I had no idea what I was to do. And I just knew that I couldn't justify my work ethic, if you want to call it an ethic. It was more, it owned me. And the time that we put in the early Apple days to justify, I used to justify it. Well, I got to save for college educations for my 4 kids. I'm responsible for the food that's on the table, and all of that. And I finally got to the point, with the Apple success, that I couldn't justify my work alcoholism, and so, I came to the Christianity during that time, even though I grew up in an Irish Catholic, family, and I knew about God, but I didn't know Him personally. So I spent 5 years studying the Word, and I just prayed, Lord, what's Your will for my life? And He gave me the parable of the Good Samaritan, which was basically to meet the present need. And I had been on 700 Club twice and a bunch of shows, and came to the realization that I was nothing but a Christian cheerleader for people to raise money because of this crazy iconic tech guy becoming a Christian. And so it turned out that the need happened to be this school where we were interviewing to send our kids, and they were $300,000 in debt, losing $30,000 plus a month, and had a 30-day lease on their property. And I go, well, there's certainly a need there, but I don't want to fail. They asked me to go on their board, and I realized they had no vision. They couldn't articulate their reason for existence, much less their mission, what they were trying to accomplish to do. So I offered to write them a business plan. And it was in the process of writing that business plan, which was 3 5-year phases. And, and I knew enough about technology and knew where technology was going, way ahead of anybody else. I donated the first Apple IIs to a school in Los Gatos. And so I watched what these kids could do, particularly what my own son could do, right? And so I knew that technology was going to be a part of education going forward. But I also realized that there was a big danger, and I think I say this in my book. I donated those first Apple IIs to the school. They didn't know what to do with them, so they cleaned out the janitorial closet, and they told the kids, free time. And at the end of the year, when the kids were on a survey asked to pick their favorite class, they picked the janitorial closet. And then the 8th grades gave the school 4 more. And now all of a sudden they didn't fit in the janitorial closet. So they decided that they would make it an official, program in the school. And I saw the first exam. They hired somebody's mom from IBM. And the first exam was the front page of the cover of the manual. And they had simply left certain words blank, and the kids had to fill them out. And I wrote a paper that saying that, Steve's vision was that technology was a mental bicycle, an amplifier for one's mind and creativity, not to take us where we've already been, but to allow us to explore, to create,
Wow.
to change. And I said, if we're not careful, the education system is going to take his mental bicycle and turn it into an exercise cycle, which is boring and doesn't go anywhere. And I think there's still a lot of truth to that today,
Yep.
even because schools have bought technology so they could claim they have technology, but they've never changed the pedagogy in the classroom, such that technology would allow them to do something other than they're already doing. And that was the start of CBL, which was basically said the pedagogy is not going to be based on memorization. It's going to be based on something that's relevant,
Yeah.
because the kids want something real, right? Where they no longer need to be the recipient of static content. They have the tools and the software now to be able to create their own unique content, including music and video
Yeah.
and podcasts and everything. And based on Vygotsky's work, that kids learn through collaboration. Now, collaboration was called cheating when I went to school, right? But that's how they learn. And finally, they want something challenging, you know? And so that formed the framework for CBL, and really for the main message in rewiring education.
Yeah.
And an example that I use, which I used, which helped people understand challenge-based learning, was first and foremost, challenge-based learning required technology. Every student needed to have their own studio, if you will, right? And so I use the example of fourth grade history, California history in fourth grade. In California, every student in fourth grade has to take California history. And there's very little in the book, because the publishers basically, they'll put just enough to get the book accepted, adopted. And so most teachers focus on missions, nothing about presidios or, the culture between the Mexicans and Americans at the time, the ranches that were owned by Mexicans. And they're asked to build a mission. And so most kids will build their mission out of sugar cubes or Legos. And I say, if you see anything else, you know that the parents helped build it, unless it was in Minecraft. Then you knew the kids did it. And so the challenge was, instead of building a mission, it was pretend you're William Randolph Hearst. The first thing the kids are going to say, well, Mr. Couch, who's William Randolph Hearst? So I said, well, look, you needed to go discover that,
Yeah.
right? And so they discovered that he was, the owner of the San Francisco Examiner, and that he had built a castle, his Hearst Castle, and he had integrated, animals and artwork and everything from all over the world. And so you're getting outside of just California, and you're seeing history in this class. And that he was friends with Hollywood, and he would throw dinner parties every weekend for the elite in Hollywood. They'd come down on a train. And so I said, and then you'd group the kids in groups of 4 and say, okay, your challenge is you're going to throw a dinner party for those individuals that made the biggest impact on California history. Who would you invite, and what would the seating chart look like? And the 4 kids go after it.
Yeah.
And they're collaborative, they're creative. It's a real example for them. It's challenging, and they have discussions. So our kids are capable of much more,
Yeah.
until you put so much concrete on their brains for memorizing facts
Hmm.
that they can no longer think outside the box.
Yeah, I really appreciate those examples. And those are examples, any of our listeners that are educators, you can take those into your classroom, take those into your school. We took your example with the dinner party in some different lessons, and then we had the students act out the different people, the different dialogues, and they recorded the conversations, and then they posted them along the dinner table. So you could click on it and hear what this person would say to this person, and that person would say to that person, and the people, the students recorded the voices as they
Yeah,
thought that
yeah,
they were. So we definitely
yeah.
ran with that.
The
Yeah.
classroom has to be active. It can't be
Yes.
passive. Yeah,
Yes. Yeah, totally agree. Now, in my experience, right, I love your emphasis on challenge-based learning. I'm all on board. I think it's great. But a lot of people are more familiar with project-based learning. And some of our listeners might be thinking now, are they
yeah,
the same? Are they different? Can you give us a little bit of a distinction between
yeah.
the two and what you're trying to get at with this challenge-based learning?
I can plug the book because it's in there. But project-based learning, two things come to my mind. Is first and foremost, you don't need technology for project-based learning.
Gotcha.
Okay, you do for challenge-based learning because you're forming collaborative network of the kids, maybe working at different times in different places.
Hmm.
Secondly, in project-based learning, the teacher hands out the project, which may not be relevant to every student. In challenge based learning, it's the class that chooses the challenge,
Hmm.
and it's automatically relative to majority of the students.
Hmm.
And so the technology and the fact that they get to pick the challenge. I visited one school in Varmont, which has the best curriculum I've ever seen. It's a challenge based learning from 3 years in kindergarten all the way up to high school.
Oh, wow.
And visited their challenge was on energy, and the eighth grade kids built a solar powered go kart. Sixth grade students built a solar powered backpack that your iPhone and your iPad could plug in,
Hmm.
and the first grade students built a solar powered oven. Now, I went to the school that I spent 10 years at, right? Their entrepreneurial week was all about selling hamburgers and pizza and who could make the most money rather than who could be the most creative, you know. So there's your two extremes, right?
Hmm.
And it really gets down to leadership.
John, you highlighted one of the important principles of challenge-based learning and your philosophy of learning is, give more responsibility to the student, allow them to pick, right? You're not forcing something down them. Why is that so important for our learning?
I will tell you another story. One of the first one-to-ones that we ever did, where every student got a computer. Um, I asked this sixth grade girl, I said, if you could tell your administrator one thing, what would it be? And her answer was very, very, very simple. Trust us.
Hmm.
Trust us. Because people are naturally inquisitive.
Yeah.
They want to learn, but
Hmm.
they don't want to do 7 pages of long division arithmetic.
Hmm.
They want to know, is this even, am I ever going to use this?
Hmm.
You know, um, and there's probably a lot that we're teaching now that people will never use.
Yeah.
And there's probably a lot of things that we could be teaching, like finance,
Hmm.
that people need to learn.
John, you mentioned something earlier that I wanted to circle back on. You said, technology, sort of the vision for it at Apple, and your vision is, a mental bicycle. But then you said, oftentimes we turn it into a boring exercise bike. How do we do that? And I guess what I'm trying to get at is how do we do that? How do we turn it into a boring exercise bike? And what are some ways to fight against that, right? To keep that, to build creativity?
Here's the challenge: you got to be creative,
Mm.
okay? And I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but I taught at Berkeley, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of hard work to be creative in the classroom. Um, and you know, people have estimated that maybe only 10% of our teachers, are creative and have the ability to, and those that are probably the best teachers you've ever had because they make everything exciting, right? Whether it's history and like you were saying, some of the things that you were doing. So I think that's really the key, and I think we have it backwards because I ran a school for 10 years, and what you'll see is you'll see a teacher, one class a teacher is creative, and what she's got in the back of the classroom is an entirely shopping center mark, and the kids are learning their math and they're learning different things by embedding themselves in the shopping experience. The other teacher is simply saying, memorize these verbs, okay? And, there's not much engagement in memorizing verbs. Or later on, memorize the periodic chart. Well, first of all, they probably never even seen the element, okay? So we built a coffee table with all the elements in it,
That's
okay?
cool.
And then you issue a challenge around that forces them to discover the answers rather than us sort of memorizing the answers, giving them the answers. In my book I talked about at what point in my education life did I change from memorizing, and that was in my junior year as a physics major, when there was only one problem on the final exam, and that was describe, the motion of a spinning top in free space. And it had never been covered in the book or a lecture or by the teaching assistant. And I saw a lot of really smart people panic, including myself. And that's when I realized, you know what? I can't memorize my way through college, and I'm not going to be able to memorize my way through a job. That was Steve's first challenge to me. He goes, "You got to build a computer that anyone can use."
Yeah.
And I go, "Yeah, that's great, Steve. Where's the book?" There is no book. There is no book. Well, can you point me to a faculty member or some research where this is going on? He goes, "No, that's why I'm hiring you." And I was scared. And I guarantee you, the kids are more motivated when they're. It's like game theory, right? You have these levels, and you're motivated to get to the next level.
John, it's interesting that you highlight creativity, as a core feature. How do we build that within teachers, within the educational environment, within schools?
Okay, well, guess what? It was already built. It was already built. It was built by Frederick Froebels. Was all about creativity.
Yeah.
And he saw children as being creative beings, created by a creative God. And so everything in kindergarten was about creativity. They would do a lot of stuff outside in nature, and then he created what he called the Froebel gifts, and they're I hate to minimize it, but it's more than blocks. It's strings. It's in fact they're still used at the Graduate School of Architecture at MIT. Frank Lloyd Wright was a big fan of the Froebel blocks in his designs. And so these kids would come back from nature, and then they'd build something with these what he called the gifts. Unfortunately, when kindergarten came over to the U.S., we basically pushed the pedagogy in the first grade, which always was about reading, down into kindergarten, and did away with the creativity, right? And then we lost, in 1912, when Rockefeller funded the education board, we lost the battle for creativity because they felt at that time what they needed the most was cogs for the Industrial Revolution. People that would not draw outside the lines, would not think about anything other than, I put this here, I put this here, I put this here. And fundamentally, our education system, with the exception of maybe some Montessori and some other, pocket environments, our public education system is like that.
So if creativity was there and it's at the core of who we are as people, and then it was sort of taken away through this industrialized model, what have you seen to be helpful to bring creativity back into the school system?
Well, probably the best example of a profession and creativity, outside the arts is chefs. I mean, the chefs create recipes.
Yeah.
We follow them, right? And I think that's the biggest challenge we have right now. Is I've got a friend of mine, Wonderful World of Science, where he doesn't have a curriculum for 8 years, but he's got examples of things that he makes you look at the world in an entirely different light. It's like, how does a bumblebee fly? When I first went to Apple, Mike Markula, told me, used to refer to a huge challenge as trying to move a 20,000-pound marshmallow. No matter how hard you push, it doesn't move. And the only way of getting it to really move is one bite at a time. So what I was hoping to do with rewiring education was to bring to the surface to parents such that they would take one bite at a time, because I don't believe education is going to change top down. I believe it's going to change bottom up as we demand more. And I mean, even, I spent 2 hours with the former Secretary of Education, who was really big on charter schools. And my point to her was, look, if the charter school isn't doing anything different than what the public school is different and is not changing the pedagogy, then where's the change?
Yeah.
Yeah,
this reminds me of something you bring up in your book. The inventor, people thought was going to change the world. And the inventor was Thomas Edison. The year was 1911. The invention was the educational film. It was basically a recording whose impact faded quickly. And it got me thinking, and I want to ask you this, and I know we're getting to the end of our conversation here. I do have a bunch more questions, but I'm going to hold off. I'm going to practice some self-control. But I'm wondering, from your perspective, what is an invention today that reminds you of Edison's educational film?
I think they have been for 20 years, thinking that technology would change education. But it's not just about the technology. It's about content in context.
Interesting.
Right? And see, what we do in the schools is we're distributors of content. It's like watching TV. It's a distribution of content. It's not in a context. It's not interactive. The kids aren't part of the creation process. They're still called to sit passively. There was an old cartoonist in France that drew a cartoon with all the kids still sitting in rows, okay, with a help, let's say, earplugs, okay.
Yeah.
And a little wire coming out of their earplugs going over to where the teacher is dropping the books in a kind of a vacuum, right? And this vacuum is supposed to convert these books into digital waves and go right into the kids' heads. Okay? Well, that was their vision of the future of education. I mean, almost every change in education, even starting with the pencil, was put down by the educators. When first books came out, because they were used to the monks, right? They'd read the scriptures, and the monks would write them down, and that was education. That's why I believe in internships and blended learning. What Mallory is doing at the Oxford Day Academy in East Palo Alto, it's not easy. It's a 20,000-pound marshmallow.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you as a computer scientist, you at the forefront of many, innovations, right? And you love technology still today. You talk about the importance of it, but you also have this other side where you're talking about context, content, creation, and we need to focus on those because technology in and of itself isn't going to get the job done. Am I accurate in sort of saying that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a crossroads between psychology and technology. I heard this teacher one day say, and she was teaching first grade. She says, I told those kids that this classroom is my home, and in my home, you respect me. And I thought, oh my gosh, what she really should have said, this is your home, and I respect each and every one of your unique talents.
Interesting.
And let's find out who's a semantic learner, who's a visual learner, who's a kinetic learner, who's an audio learner, and what combinations, and let me put together with you challenges. And the teachers that have the passion are great teachers. And I can name the people that, 2 or 3 teachers that had passion and brought learning, made it relevant.
John, that's sad that you can only name 2 or 3. That's
I know.
not good.
That's the nature of it, isn't it? Yeah.
Oh, man.
Yeah, welcome to our education system, huh?
Yeah.
And then you walk out of that and you meet Steve Jobs and he goes, I want you to build me something that no one's built.
I want to pause this podcast for a moment to let you know about another great podcast.
Hey everyone, my name is Mike Dunn, and I'm one of the co-hosts of Rethinking EDU. Our podcast is a roundtable discussion about education possibility. We talk with professionals from around the country who are doing groundbreaking work reimagining and remaking schools. Come check us out at rethinkingedu.co or wherever you get your podcasts.
Now let's get back to the show. John, this has been so great. As we wind things down today, who do you want to give a shout out to?
My team over the years, they were blazers. They trusted me in the early Apple days to, on this crazy idea of the mouse and the cut and paste paradigm. And then my education team, when I came back, incredible teachers and Apple distinguished educators. And then probably the one that I respect the most is Marco Torres. I did not know Marco Torres, but when Steve hired me back in 2002 to run education, he said to me, he goes, John, there's only one person you need to meet in education, and that's Marco Torres. And he was right. Marco lived it in the classroom, probably the most creative individual I've ever met. His students have formed their own companies. He's buried 16 of his students in probably the worst school district in California, and yet he has a passion and a sense of humor and a heart for kids that I wish all school could have a teacher like Marco.
Time for the final word. What would you like to say to close out this podcast?
I think it's really simple. I think it's 3 words, and it's how I ended my book. Be the change. Be the change.
John, thank you so much for joining me on Diving Deep EDU. To those listening, thank you. Thank you for tuning in to Diving Deep EDU. If you like this episode, subscribe, share it out, post a review on Apple Podcasts. All of those things will help get this podcast out to more people. Until next time.
Wow, it's time to reflect. That's astounding. You've been checking out the podcast from Matthew Downing. Hope you like diving deep like a scuba diver. And the show provoked hope, that's our true desire.